Ellie, do something cute so we know if the video works. Backing up really is not helpful. Okay, the project of tonight is to see if I can cut and put together the many, many, many pages that are printed home patterns. I taped together all of the pattern pieces and trimmed them to the correct size. Alright, so I've cut it all out. This is the boning chart, the boning layout, and then these are the actual pattern pieces for the stays. These are the pieces that I didn't even touch. They are the view that I'm not doing, or the size that I'm not doing, or the style that I'm not doing, because you have all the options in there. So my thoughts so far are that it went together really well. I didn't have any trouble lining everything up. The size was true to form on my printer, which was nice and easy. I'm going to be making the historical view, which has the lacing up the front, because I like to torture myself with eyelets. And I'm going to be making the straight style, as not a very curvy person. So I'm going to make the 42 straight fit, because that's closest to my measurements. I actually went down a little bit in the bust to get closer to the waist measurement I needed. But I'm hoping that this front opening will give me just a little hair of wiggle room there. So the next step is going to be digging through my pattern or my fabric stash and seeing what I can find that we can use to get started on some stays. The aftermath of putting together e-patterns. It's a bonus dog. So I'm opting to make my stays out of this blue sateen fabric that I had left over from a Victorian dress. And for my strength layer, I'll be using 2 layers of this heavy cotton canvas. It's a little thinner than duck cloth, but it's 100% cotton, so it should stretch and be nice and breathable. I traced out my patterns with a Sharpie, which is actually pretty historically accurate, as you can find patterns with the ink lines still drawn on them. I traced them all out onto both my sateen and my strength layer and cut them out. I wish I could actually cut this fast. I'm tracing the lines for the seam allowances and the tabs with a tracing wheel and chalk paper. Here's where we're at. I have cut out all the pieces and I've transferred all of the seam allowance lines using a transfer wheel and paper, which makes a big mess, so my hands are blue. I normally would not bother to transfer all the markings because I am that kind of sewer who just flies with it, but I'm trying to give this pattern its absolute due diligence and have it come out just like it's supposed to, so we are going to push on. The next step is putting the boning layouts onto them and transferring the boning lines. So I initially began tracing the boning diagram with the same tracing wheel, and I attempted to use a ruler. I found it really hard to get flush against the ruler, so then I attempted to just freehand them and be as straight as possible. And I'm here to tell you that that really does not work very well. I would not recommend it. I ended up with a whole jumble of lines
that didn't really line up, and I had to go back over them with a ruler and a pencil. And specifically on the front panels, it just turned into a big, unreadable mess. I was able to salvage every piece except for the two fronts. Those I opted to recut. You can see here how unusable and unreadable and what a total mess of trying to clarify the lines my original attempt at using a tracing wheel ended up being. In the end, I switched to a much better method in which I used a Sharpie and drew through the paper to transfer the start and the end of all my lines, and then just connected them with the ruler, which was much faster and much more effective, and I would recommend it heartily over using a tracing wheel for these straight boning lines. The next step was to pin all of my fronts stacked up with their 2 layers of canvas. I then basted around all of those seams. The next thing the pattern has you do is press back the center back and the center front edges. Now the pattern calls for cutting into the center front so that you only fold back the top edge, which in retrospect, I don't think I would do again. I would just fold back the entire edge because you end up folding it back when you whip down the seam allowance, and I think it creates an unnecessary weak spot. The next step was to sew boning channels for a long time. There's a lot of boning channels. Did I mention I sewed more boning channels? After I sewed all the boning channels, I sewed the eyelets. I swear I filmed this, but I have lost the footage. So you'll just have to trust me that I sewed a whole bunch of eyelets. Yep, still sewing boning channels. After I sewed all the boning channels, the next step was putting the boning into the boning channels. I'm using artificial whalebone, which is a plastic product, but I think approximates it the best. Then I basted on the machine with a largest stitch. I basted my pieces together so that I could do a first fitting. And you'll see here, it didn't go entirely as planned. It's just a bit too big.
Okay, I just wanted to talk for a minute about the alterations I did to my pattern. So my pattern is too big. So I guess I'm squishier than I accounted for, which is unusual for me. So this is the original side back, and this is the original side back with this seam allowance folded under. The pattern has you fold under and whip down the seam allowances, which is the period way of doing it. So I am taking in a little bit in every seam I can, but at some point I needed to take too much out. I was going to lose a bone somewhere. So I've picked this bone to lose, to take a ½ inch out of each of these edges to get me a full inch out of these. And then I took another inch out in 1/4 inches around everything else. And that should hopefully be enough. It's rare for me that things are too big. Anyway. So I'm just moving this. This is the original stitch line where I've basted here, and I'm moving it over a ½ inch, which puts it somewhere in here. And this is the new one. So you can see that I only have 2 bones here instead of the 3. So that's where I'm choosing to alter it, and I'm hoping that that'll be enough, and I won't have to worry about it after this.
After you take it apart and I made my adjustments, I whipped all of the seam allowances to the inside, which is the period construction way of making stays, and then you butt the pieces together and whip stitch the seams. So you can see here I'm starting the whip stitch between the seams, and now I'll speed it up so that we all don't have to torturously watch me sewing seams. I'm using a heavy cotton quilting thread that's doubled for strength. You do the center front last, so you work in 2 halves, and then it's very satisfying to be able to open it up and lay it flat and have what look like stays. Not all stays had straps in the 18th century, but I chose to follow the pattern and add straps. I think that they really help with back posture. I did find attaching them kind of bulky and a little bit difficult to get the inner lining to whip down over the other side. I covered my seam allowances with twill tape, cotton twill tape, and then I tried them on for another fitting because the last thing you want to do is finish the binding and have them not fit. I bound them in the same cotton twill tape and they were done. So my final thoughts on this pattern are that I really enjoy the shape. They are a little long in the back. My biggest things that I would change are a few slight construction things. I would make the eyelets spaced farther apart. When they're spaced that close together, I have trouble tightening my own laces. And I, in the end, only laced every other hole, so I wasted a fair amount of time doing eyelets for no reason. I also, on the center back, would cut the interlining flush and only fold over the fashion fabric, so I was only doing eyelets through 4 layers instead of 6. But otherwise, I think it was a really great pattern, and I would strongly recommend it.
I like that you're videotaping your wife taking off her corset instead of helping.
I knew that was really going to be the next thing out of her mouth. 100%.